So how does self-compassion lead to action? Let's talk about it. Hello, Thunderhawk Coaching Will here. Today we're going to talk about how self-compassion can lead to action. So something I notice with a lot of clients that have really low self-esteem is that often it leads to this pit of despair, which is something I see a lot. And I think a response I get from a lot of clients that are kind of stuck in this way is like, well, what's the point being nice to myself? Like, that never led to anything. That never led to me, like, getting to where I want to be, right? And the interesting thing is self-hatred can be kind of like dirty rocket fuel that can sometimes like push you to do things. So somebody in that position might be like, but historically, when I felt low and I felt like I'm only worth something if I do X, or I'm only worth something if I do Y, why shouldn't I continue to hate myself to push myself to do more, right, in the short term? By doing that, you're putting yourself in the external motivation camp, which means that you'll only feel the value and efforts of your actions when they're externally validated. Now, on paper, that might sound like a good thing, right? You put effort in, and then you get positive feedback from the external world. You work hard, and then you get a bonus at work, right? There's nothing wrong with that innately, okay? But it's about the balance, the internal and the external motivation. And this is where self-compassion comes in. So when you are self-compassionate, you expand the window of action. And by that, I mean, if you have very low self-compassion, you can only be in this tiny little perfect window. If you're not in the perfect window, you suck, right? You either feel nothing, neutral, because you met the standard, or you suck and you punish yourself and you're like, why did I do that? I'm so stupid. What's wrong with me? I should do better. And I don't know if you guys have felt this, right? But it's easy to go down this spiral of self-hatred of like, oh, I'm a mistake. I did a whoopsie. I'm bad. And all of these like broader labels that we use to describe ourselves in our head when we feel like we make a mistake or error. It could be, I'm a fuck up, right? Something I've heard commonly from a lot of clients. The idea of being a fuck up traps you in this box of like what a fuck up is, right? So a fuck up is somebody that like doesn't do anything, or when they do things it fails. So what's the point? So a lot of this logic inevitably leads to what's the point? When we adjust how we talk to ourselves and we say, in that isolated incident, I made a mistake. We take it from an identity to a blip on a bigger trend. And that can be up or down depending on how you feel about yourself. And self-compassion can allow a greater window of action. Because like the reality is, regardless of how competent any of us are, our life is like a D&D game, right? I don't know if you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, but if you roll the dice of life, sometimes you can have the highest stats going, right? And you can still roll a 1, and you can still fail. And you could still, it's statistically possible, even if it's unlikely, to roll like 30 ones, right? Things can just like not go your way sometimes. And it can get to the point where we can kind of create patterns and identities and themes in our own head, because like our brains are built for patterns, right? So when we say I'm a fuck up, we're reinforcing that pattern, right? And we're going to create patterns in our lives that will align with that narrative, because we're storytellers. We make stories. We make stories about ourselves. We make stories about other people. You know, I make the story about myself that I'm a helper or a supporter, or maybe even on a larger sense, a healer, right? That's just a story. But does that story help work towards your values, towards what you care about, towards action, if that's what you need? Because I always think about this thought to action ratio, and self-compassion is a really important part of this. The thought to action ratio is how much do you think versus you do. So I feel like if you're online on YouTube right now, you're probably thinking a lot, right? We're all thinking a lot. When we think a lot, we do very little. When we do very little, a lot of our needs can sometimes be neglected. Social needs, even the ability to prove to ourselves that we can go to the store and like buy something from the store, or feel safe going out for a walk, or even like ask for a promotion, or pursue a romantic interest, etc., etc. Right? Those muscles atrophy. They get weaker over time as we don't do and we think instead. Right? That's kind of my opinion of the remit of coaching. We focus on this thought to action ratio. We look at your feelings, and we look at how your feelings inform the narratives that build into the stories you tell yourself and keep you ultimately locked in the position you're in. So that's why self-compassion is really important, because the idea of being self-compassionate with yourself is kind of like ironing and massaging the rigidity in these narratives. This is even harder for neurodiverse people, by the way, because especially if you have a diagnosis of autism or ADHD, it can be really, really tough to be willing to be fluid with your own labels of self. I would even find that like the label of autism and ADHD, it can pose challenges here, because it can create boxes of what you can and can't do for some people, if I'm honest in my experience, right? And they can be valuable to acknowledge what might be overwhelming or overstimulating. And I'm not saying there's not value in those professional diagnoses done by clinicians and whatever treatments may come along with them. But there is an inherent bias that can come with these labels that has restricted the experience and lives of clients I've worked with. So when you want to do more in your life, because let's be honest, it's really easy to find a lot of really negative media out there. The algorithm we're on right now is like, you gotta feel bad because you react to that more strongly, and bad things will happen, so feel bad. That's inevitable, right? But what can we do in relation to that? If things are bad, right, the more we consume negative things in the world and internalize that, add that to our own understanding and feeling of like how the world is, or there's a disconnect between what the world we want and the world that is, or how we wish we were living and how we are living. Often a big part of moving towards from what we wish to what we are, moving from the are to the wish, like there's got to be a degree of action, right? There's got to be attempts made. And we've got to be careful broader kind of broad statements of I'm a failure or I've tried everything before. That's a common thing I hear from a lot of clients. The really important thing to understand when you think about all the things you've tried historically is that you are always accruing experience, right? Again, like in D&D, you're accruing experience, you're learning new things, you're changing every time you do something. You are a fluid being. You're as fluid as you believe you are, but the self-compassion softens you up and makes you more fluid. And the more fluid you are, the more you're able to adapt to different situations and potentially get a benefit out of it, right? If you have a rigid mindset, that can make it really hard to be self-compassionate, but also to initiate any kind of change. And you'll wallow and you'll get stuck in this pit of despair. And it's important to acknowledge those feelings, because those feelings are like majority what people are feeling if they're in that state, right? They feel despair, acknowledge the despair, sit with the despair. It's heavy, it's hard, and the heavier and harder it is, the less likely people are to want to be around you, because then you're going to be less of a chill hang, right? And a lot of people, we all got our own struggles, right? So some people are going to be like, well, that's too much for me. No, thank you. And they're going to go their own way, right? That happens. I think that happens. If you disagree, please write it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you find it's useful. But we need to exercise the self-compassion muscle. Gratitude is cool and great and all, but I think a part of self-compassion I really appreciate is acknowledging the reality of the instance and being aware of the language we use that extends out to a broader assumption and trend we make about ourselves. So, for example, I made a mistake on this presentation today, versus I'm bad at presentations could be covering the same event, has very different connotations for how we see ourselves and how we feel approaching similar tasks in the future. Because if we think I'm bad at presentations and then we are presented with a presentation, we are going to be anxious. We're going to be in our head. We're going to assume the worst, which is going to have us emotionally withdrawn from the experience, and we are going to perform worse. So when you've made this mistake, you can go, well, I made this mistake in the presentation. How can I improve? What can I do differently? What emotionally is being triggered relative to the mistake? That's an important question to ask yourself. So if you make a mistake, what other memories come up that feel related to the mistake? Right? You made a mistake at a presentation. Maybe you made a mistake when you were in school doing a presentation. Or maybe people didn't listen to your ideas and thought you were boring in a social situation. And that rejection really hurt, right? I think it's important to line this back and then be aware of those feelings. And then when we have the awareness of those feelings, then we can choose, do we want to continue this trend in line? That's a question we need to ask ourselves when we're trying to increase our action, right? I'm going to leave it there for today. That is the idea. You've been wonderful. I've been Will. Good luck increasing your thought to action ratio to have a little more action and maybe a little less thought, if that's what you want. But you've been wonderful. I've been Will. I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.